also very jealous because I haven't had my dinner yet. But so seeing so many people eating is distracting a bit. But I promise to be sharp. So I haven't taught you guys, but again, I tend to speak fast sometimes, so I don't know the connection. I don't know how well you hear me. If there is any point in time where you want to ask me any questions, you want to have clarifications or me to repeat something, just please do not hesitate to raise your hand. Let's keep this informal and as a conversation rather than me talking. I'll say a few things in general about the Italian elections and the situation now. So I'll try to go through various points. The first one would be maybe what it is that we're voting for, and how the system works. Then maybe a couple of things on the political system. So who are the political parties, and then the different platforms maybe, and then we can talk about the likelihood results and what are the potential consequences of these elections. There are a couple of things that everybody knows of the Italian system. One, actually two, he mentioned already in the introduction. The first one is, in the last 4 years, we had a lot of governments. Now, you can even go back to 1946, 48, where Italy, on average, had a government every 15 months. So that's a little bit different than if you ask a German, but they had, Merkel for almost a couple of decades, or Macron, France, and also the US, where you have these cycles of 4 or 8 years with only one executive. The Italian system is very different and unique in that sense. But at the same time, also the introduction said that Italy is the third largest economy of the European Union. And that says that maybe sometimes you don't need a government or a stable government to create development. One of the things that is unique of the Italian system is that, according to some political scientists, that precisely because you have a very fragmented society and divided across towns, regions, so there is a lot of history that leads to us to think that the Italians are not really united, or don't feel that they belong to one core country. Then this fragmentation is filtered to different governments, which allows then the legitimacy of the institution to be stronger, precisely because everyone is represented very often, because you have this rotation of governments. That's also one of the features of the Italian system. So my point is, we're going to through a couple of features. Don't think that one is better than the other. Just try to place whatever feature or qualities or characteristics of Italy, and therefore also in general countries, within their specific context. And that's what makes sense. What makes sense is to look at the balance, to look at the legitimacy of the institution, the capacity of delivering policies, rather than simply counting the governments. And then if you count many governments, the country is not stable, or vice versa. Try to always to place these features and these qualities in a context. Then let's start talking about the election. So now we're voting for the renewal of the parliament. The parliament is bicameral, so there is a Senate and a lower chamber, Camera and Senato. Now, this is one of the few systems in the planet that has, it's a perfect bicameral system where any law has to be approved by both chambers in exactly the same format. Now, people very often ask me, why do you have this? It's very inefficient. Do you guys know why? I take it as a no. So, but you know who's Mussolini, right? Who Mussolini was? Yes. So in 1946, we had the Constitutional Assembly. And what the Constitutional Assembly was thinking and considering was, listen, what is the problem that we had in the past 20 years? The problem that we had was a very strong government who managed to do whatever the prime minister or the government wanted to do. How do we counter the power of the government? Then we have a chamber, so we have a parliament, and then we empower the parliament. Yes, but one chamber is not enough. We're going to have a second chamber, but having two chambers is not enough, because then if you give them different powers, the government can go to different chambers whenever they have different needs and overrule the chambers. So what do? We make the two chambers with exactly the same powers. So the government has to be able to convince two chambers that are representing also different constituencies. The government needs to convince both of them to vote the same piece of legislation. On top of it, not only the chambers were two, not only they had the same power, not only they were representing different constituencies, one the people and the other the regions, but they also had different electoral bases. Until 2021, if you you could vote for the lower chamber only if you were 18, but if you could vote for the Senate only after turning 25, which means that you had different basically population voting for the different chambers, making it likely to have different majorities. So the same electoral system, the same elections would lead to different majorities in different chambers, which means that the government needs to have a wide consensus if the government wants to rule. And that was, again, the whole story was to create a counterpower to the government after the 20 years of fascism in Italy. And that's why we have this system now. In the last years, these needs were a little bit reduced. So now in 2021, there was this constitutional reform where that reduced the number of members of parliament. The chamber went from 630 to 400, the Camera, so the lower chamber, and the Senate went from 315 to 200. So now we have even fewer members, and this distinction between voting age was erased, which means that now anybody can vote for both, and that, you know, is in theory supposed to lead to two exact same majorities in the lower chamber and in the Senate. Now, I will not go into details with the electoral system because it is indeed very complicated. But at the same time, I want to reason a little bit on the logic of the electoral system. So the electoral system is combining elements of a proportional system and a majoritarian system. The majoritarian system is what you have in the US. You have an electoral college, you know, whoever wins gets most votes in the college gets elected. And that idea is we need to create a connection between the territory and the parliament, which means that each portion of the territory in Italy has representatives that you can directly go and complain if things do not work well. So there is a representative of the territory, and then there are also there is also a proportional system. So these these colleges with one person, they are combined, and then the combination of those distributes a number of seats on proportional terms, which means that proportional, you can get a number of votes according to your coalition. And that's where it gets complicated, which I will not get into details, but it will become clearer in a second. The idea is then to minimize the problems or the inequalities that you create with the majoritarian system, with the proportional system. But the two votes are linked. And that is the tricky part. When you go to vote, normally when you combine two electoral systems, you have two votes. You vote for the person in this district where there is one person being elected, and you vote for a list where then there is a proportional distribution. In Italy, they decided not to do that, and they decided to tie these votes. Basically, you vote once. So you vote once for the person running, and then the lists, which is political parties, connected to this person, they get their vote. So that's why, you know, it's a semi-proportional, because you're not really free to vote. Let's say a Republican candidate and the Democrat, the list of the Democrats, you can't unlink the vote. And that is where the proportional principle of the electoral system is a little bit weakened by the design of the law. So this is the way it works. And the parliament, Italy is a parliamentary system, which means that we vote for the parliament, and then the government as a whole is voted by the parliament. So it's not like in the US where you vote for the executive, the president, and you vote for the legislative, Congress. In Italy, in a parliamentary system, you vote for the parliament, then the government comes out of the parliament. That's why it's very important, this election, because the results of this election will determine who is in government as of, well, a couple of weeks after Sunday. Then, if there are no questions, let's talk about who is running. What is the political party system and the political system, how it is organized. Historically, Italy had until 1994, it was called a dominant party system, where you have one big party, and then this party is always in government, and occasionally this party needs other parties to support this party, to form the government. Because remember, once you vote for the parliament, a government needs the majority of the votes in parliament to be operative. The big party was the Christian Democrats, the Democrazia Cristiana, and that was dissolved in 1994. There was a big clean hands scandal in Italy when 2/3 of the members of parliament were indicted, and therefore the president of the republic decided to send the parliament home, and then we had new elections. And as of 1994, we have something that for a couple of years we had something that was that is called by-party system, where you would vote either for the center right or the center left. This lasted for a couple of years, and now it's more of a multi-party system. When you go to vote, you have multiple options to vote, and then either one coalition gets the majority, or they have to enter into a discussion and then they have to form a majority once they get into parliament, which is very typical for the Netherlands, where I live at the moment. Who is running in these elections? We have fundamentally four blocks. There is a block on the center right, which is formed by three major parties and other smaller parties. The center right is the block where historically Berlusconi was coming from, and he's still running. And by the way, if you have Twitch and TikTok, especially TikTok, he opened a channel on TikTok and it was pretty embarrassing. But he is also, he's still active and he's still doing very active political campaigns. And then in the same coalition, we have the League with Matteo Salvini, and the League was the Northern League, which used to be a party in the 90s and the 80s for the Federation of Italy. So they wanted to have a state or a big region in the north, because they always had this resentment towards the capital, and they wanted to have more fiscal independence compared to others. And that's why back in the days it was called the Northern League. And then especially with this populist movement in the last few years, then it became, instead of being a federalist or a regional party, it jumped into this nationalist vibe that we have seen in a number of parties in European countries. So now it's called the League, and it's more for Italy being more independent from the others. And then we have Fratelli d'Italia, which is Brothers of Italy. This is the former, the follow-up of what used to be Mussolini's party. But this is, of course, we're talking about 80 years ago, so it's not really Mussolini's parties anymore. But it is the political spectrum with a couple of ideas that are directly linking the party to a certain idea of right. Now, I need to say one thing about this. I don't know how much you know about European history, but both fascism and Nazism are historically defined as rightist parties, and it is true indeed. What we tend to forget very often is that both parties were actually socialist parties. So Mussolini was the director of L'Avanti, and he was a member of the Socialist Party. Hitler was the leader of the National Socialist Party, not only Nazism. So the idea is, and that was coming out, both Italy and Germany were coming out of very deep economic recession. So being close to the workers, close to the weaker ones, is the core of the ideology that then became fascism and Nazism. So state being very present in the life of us, of the individuals, because the state was actually helping the people to solve their problems. Or both in any terms, that's why they're called totalitarian system, because they were very present in the economics aspect of their life, but also in the education, religion, social life. Everything was organized because the state was taking care of you. Which means when you say right in Europe, you actually mean a very present state in the economy. While you say right in the US, it means very little state in the economy. So that is one of the things that is difficult sometimes to communicate between North American audiences and us, because the right is not necessarily a role of the state in our lives, but the state is actually very, very present. because again, there is a socialist connection. The main difference between Nazism and communism, of course, is because of the role of the private property and the private sector, that in communism, this is way less prominent than in Germany in the 30s or in Italy in the 20s and the 30s. Why do I say this? Because when we say center-right in Italy, we do not mean necessarily people that are advocating for a very light role of the state in the economy. Quite the contrary. Very often there is what is, especially with Meloni's party, there is a strong ideology in protecting and supporting that the state needs to be present in, for example, companies or in distributing welfare state. So that is the center right. Then we have, of course, if you have a center right, you have a center left. The center left is a bit more complicated than that, because we have what it is called the Democratic Party. Democratic Party entered into an alliance with the Green Party and the former Communist Party. And that is, of course, and that's where the confusion begins, because they're also for a strong role of the state in the economy, because of course they are more for the left. And we have Enrico Letta as being the candidate or the leading figure in the Democratic Party. So we have the center right, the center left. Then we have other two smaller groups, still very important. One is called, it's at the center of these two, at least. Again, geographically, we can discuss whether this location makes any sense, but let's, for the sake of simplicity at the moment, let's think about the spectrum, where we have the center right, the center left, and in the middle, you have what they call themselves the third pole, or the third group, which is a combination of two political parties, especially Azione, which is led by Carlo Calenda, who is a former minister of the Renzi government, and he was also an ambassador before at the European Union, and it comes from, he's a former manager, and Matteo Renzi, who is a former prime minister of Italy. And then you have, and so that's the third, and then you have one party that is more difficult to locate, and this is the Five-Star Movement. Now, the Five-Star Movement became very known in 2018 when they got over 30% of the votes, more or less what Mussolini's party got, by the way, 33% of the votes. And it was known because it was led by a comedian called Beppe Grillo. You might have heard of that as well. In the meantime, they were in government a couple of times, but they never reached the majority with the previous electoral mandate. And in the meantime, they split. So half of it, at least half of it in terms of members of parliament, entered into an alliance with the Partito Democratico, so with the center left. So the former minister of, the current minister of foreign affairs, Luigi Di Maio, is the leader of this group, and it is allied with the Democratic Party. And the others are outside. They're running alone in a sense. And their leader is a former Prime Minister, Giuseppe Conte, who's also a colleague because he's a professor of law. So these are the four options, let's say, that you can have. And there are other smaller parties, especially in different regions. But these are the four blocks that everybody is talking about. Any questions? Am I talking too much? Everything's fine?
I think it's great. I think it's very comprehensive, but I think we're getting, I think we just the right quotient of, like, you know, giving us a background that we need, most of us that don't have like a familiarity with Italian politics. And I think it was just you did a great job in like identifying the four groups. And I especially like the last comment that you made about the Five-Star Movement, that they're very difficult to locate because they have shifted right over time since 2018. They seem to be on the right now. They seem to be more left in some way. So can you talk a little bit about that shift in Italian politics, even over the last year? Because you had a presidential election at the beginning of the year, which is separate than what we have been discussing. But if you give us like a little bit of the mapping of this characters, the Giorgia Meloni's, and the people that we don't necessarily see, Mattarella and Draghi, who seem to be not necessarily in the forefront as you listed, but they're very, very important players here.
Absolutely. No, this is part of the institutional story of Italy. So two questions. The first one was on the Five-Star Movement. and then on the role of Mattarella and Draghi in this institutional setting in the last 2 years, basically, of the Italian political story. Then the Five-Star Movement. The Five-Star Movement comes out of what we call this global phenomenon called populism. And what really united the Five-Star Movement was a lot of dissatisfaction with the current system, whatever dissatisfaction it was. And that's why then it becomes very difficult to locate the Five-Star Movement, whether they're right or left, because they actually collected this dissatisfaction of different portions of the population. So, for instance, on immigration, the Five-Star Movement, and this is one of the European cleavages or key factors in determining politics way beyond Italy, which is on immigration. A lot of Five-Star Movement supporters were really anti-immigration, which would place the center, the Five-Star Movement to the center right, because of course, anti-immigration policies are normally portrayed to be on the center right spectrum, with closing the borders, making sure that there are no migrants coming. This is one of the things that is not that talked about. So thanks, Petrus, for the question. But if you think carefully, who should be against immigration is the left. Because if you have immigration, especially the immigration that you have in a lot of European countries, which is low-skilled immigrants, it means that you have people coming into your country and doing a low-skilled labor at a lower price, which means that the weaker workers, the ones that are low-skilled, then they lose their jobs. And who is supposed to be representing normally these people? It is the center-left or the leftist parties. Now, at the same time, this happens especially in the 90s, one of the messages was the left was opening up globalization, integration, which was an inspiration of the left since the beginning of the left, especially this idea of internationalization, globalism. And then in Europe, you get these different constituencies where the center left was not supporting or representing the request of the ones who were actually paying the consequences of globalization, because we're de facto supporting the request of the big companies who wanted to open up. Because if you want to have more market, what you want less borders and be able to sell your products everywhere. And that's why you have one of these tensions there, where the Five-Star Movement was, on the one hand, representing the instances of the weaker ones. And by doing that, they were for closing borders, not for opening them up. And in a way, there is its coherence, of course, because at the same time, they were also for a universal payment system. So basically, a minimum wage, but not a minimum wage, but a universal salary. So what they were supporting is that no one was supposed to have no euros in their monthly bank account ever. And that's also when they managed to decide that, they also, one of the slogans was, we defeated poverty, because they managed to pass a law where everybody would get a minimum salary per month whenever they didn't have a job. And that is, of course, clearly a center-left policy. So that's why it's difficult to locate them. And that's also why when they won the elections in 2018, they had the majority, but the relative majority. And then they ran with the political platform that was against everyone else. But then they had the relative majority, but not the absolute majority. So they needed to enter into a coalition with someone else. And that someone else was people that hated them, or they hated the others. So they had a long discussion with the center-left, with the Partito Democratico, which refused to enter into an alliance with them. Then they were forced to have an alliance with the League, but only the League. The League was already running with Giorgia Meloni, but in that moment, Giorgia Meloni said, I don't want to have a government with the Five-Star Movement. So there was a government only of the Five-Star Movement and the League for a couple of years. Then after two governments, because they had a reshuffling, that's when the situation arrived with Mario Draghi. There was a moment where the government collapsed and the parliament was struggling to find, and then I'm getting to the second question, where the parliament was struggling to find a majority. And that's when the president of the republic becomes very important in the Italian institutional system. Normally, we say that these are symbolic powers, the one of appointing the prime minister, because if you have a majority in parliament, the prime minister is voted by the parliament, so there is no decision making there. But in the moment in which there is no clear majority, then the president of the republic has to talk to different people, to different groups in parliament, and see whether they would be willing to vote for one person. And that's when he managed to convince Mario Draghi to come in. And then Mario Draghi eventually said, I come in if everybody votes for me, because I'm not there I'm not a politician. I come here from outside the parliament. I'm coming because you called me and you asked me for a favor, and therefore I will come only at this condition. And then what happened is that almost the majority, almost all political parties in parliament voted for Draghi, but one party, which is Meloni's parties, Brothers of Italy. And then, so we had for 2 years a situation with Mario Draghi, prime minister, which was not elected in parliament, but he was supported by 80% of the political parties in the parliament, and one party that was against it, which is the Brothers of Italy. This dynamic also explains a little bit why the Brothers of Italy now is so large, because they basically are now collecting all the dissatisfactions and people complaining against the government in the last 2 years. They're now all voting for Giorgia Meloni and the Brothers of Italy. So this is also the role of Sergio Mattarella as the President of the Republic and Mario Draghi. One last thing about Sergio Mattarella, he is the second in the history being voted for the second mandate as the President of the Republic. The last one was Giorgio Napolitano before Mattarella, but he was voted again only for a short period of time. He was very old when he was voted again, and he was voted again because the parliament couldn't find a majority to vote the President of the Republic. And the same story came, as Peter was saying, 1.5 years ago, 2 years ago, when Sergio Mattarella was voted again, and he was voted again because no other candidate would receive the majority of the votes from the parliament, which is a little bit of a unique situation. But both of them have played a very important role in the last 2 years, especially because then with the pandemic and the war, the authority, the international recognition of Mario Draghi was very, very useful for the Italian government to then manage to negotiate the European Recovery Fund, for instance, and to play a role in the last months with the war on Russia. Did I answer the questions, Pedro? Because I can talk for a long time, but I need to control myself.
More than answer the questions. Are there any questions from everybody else? I mean, because I have a ton of things to. Anybody want to jump in? I have a question or a comment, or because I mean the big question for me is like, and everybody's scratching their heads, is like, watching Giorgia Meloni over the last few months, right? And everybody in Europe is watching that, and she's actually, the thing that becomes more concerning is that she's very smooth. She's in her 40s. She's a woman. She's not like the usual sort of like populist. And the fact that she stayed outside, she hasn't made the mistakes like of a Salvini or others. So how much of that carries through after Sunday, where really she really brings that 25 to 30% or whatever she gets on Sunday and delivers something that we haven't seen before.
That's the $1 million question. A couple of things that, yeah, sorry?
I said, that's why we've got you.
Then I'll send you the bank account number later. If I get the answer right, please. Or a pizza will do, No, jokes aside, there are a couple of things that make Giorgia Meloni different from the others. The five-star movement, they were everything but politicians. They were, the leader was a comedian. It was an effort supported by a private company. There was a media company. So it was a lot of communication, very good communication campaigns being put together by the five-star movement. The League as well. The League is one of the longest parties around, but Salvini never held positions of government until 2018, when then he became the Minister of Interior. And then the government collapsed because he was half drunk at the beach, making statements on TV, and everything collapsed because of that. So we're talking about that. Giorgia Meloni is a different type of character. She was one of the youngest ministers of the history of the Republic. She's been in government possibly even before I came to your course, Petrus, a few decades ago. So she is a long-term politician. So don't be fooled by her young age. She has a long history. She was a minister. She played in government. So she is a different character than the others. So that's important, this difference for me to say. Then she has managed in the last years to reshape a little bit her image. Now, in the electoral campaign, for instance, there were a lot of videos summarizing all the times that she's been campaigning to leave the euro. Now, these things are nowadays we have the history, we have the memory of a squirrel, so we don't remember much. But so now this didn't even make it into the electoral campaign, but she has been advocating and supporting a lot Italy leaving the euro. And of course, you can do these things when you are outside. The five-star movement was the same. So we need to leave the euro. Then they enter into the foggy bottom. They open the bank account, the budget, and they say, well, maybe it's not a great idea after all to leave the euro. So there is a lot of dynamics there. So where the role of the institutions and the system of alliances is also very, very important. So in a nutshell, long story short, I think she has been talking a lot of very provocative things in the past. This is not what gave her this boost in electoral terms. Well, by the way, she hasn't got those votes yet. So let's see whether she gets them. But assuming that the polls are correct and she gets 20-25%, then I think that this is also really the product of the League losing a lot of votes and Forza Italia also to lose a lot of votes. So these are not new votes. This is still center-right votes. More or less, the center-right always got in between 40 and 45%. They lost when the left was united, and they won when the left was not united. So it's not there is not a lot of electoral volatility in Italy. And now the question whether she can deliver and what she delivers is determined also by the general conditions. Italy this year became a net. It was always a net contributor to the European Union. Now we're getting more money than what we pay to the EU, which means that Italy is in a very fragile state. I don't see Giorgia Meloni being so irresponsible to go and play with this toy, because she is smart enough not to do so. The electoral campaign in itself was less in that direction. But then yet she has an internal struggle, and then the constituency is still there. Those who are complaining because the last 20 years in Italy were economically very tough for a lot of actors, then they will want to have answers. So rather than seeing some crazy things that we have seen before, I'm more likely to see, or very irresponsible or off the line behavior. What I see is a slow economic challenge that might be creating a big deficit in the budget, because Meloni has promised, and if she becomes with the coalition, then they will have to deliver. So that is what I see a little bit. I don't see a danger of fascism coming up. So I see an economic challenge that they would have to deal with, and at the same time, there are a lot of groups that, while Meloni is not a fascist or someone who would become a dictator, a lot of constituencies that are behind those groups, they are. Now the question is, if something happens in the different cities or in the different neighborhoods of cities, then we will tolerate those things, or we will try to crack them down. So this is question number one. Question number two, nobody said anything about organized crime in the electoral campaign. No one. So the mafias were not discussed. Well, I really like Italy, but I can't hide the fact that we have an issue with organized crime. And therefore, nobody talking about that is a big red flag for me. So there are these two things. I think, and I want to trust the institutions of being solid enough to hold the earthquake that would be caused by irresponsible or audacious economic policies. I don't see the democratic danger, but I see the danger of authoritarian practices here and there, because the constituencies behind those political parties have been already behaving and claiming certain and fighting for certain values. So let's see what happens. Because, and then I stop, but one of the things of these polls that you were citing and quoting, in those polls, 40% of the voters were undecided, which means that depending on how the last 2-3 weeks went, a lot of things might have changed. So let's see what happens next week.
Let me ask you this. I know Cole has his hand up very briefly, because we've seen this throughout Europe lately, the last cycle. There's not just an issue of polarization, but there's an issue of participation. Do you suspect that 40% is undecided and goes to the polls on Sunday, or that 40% stays out?
It could go either way, because a lot of people, also people that I've been talking to, so the elite, the intellectuals, and then the rich ones, because now with I only talk to the rich ones and talk to the, it's difficult. We are in a bubble, so if you get into university, my friends, you're all in a bubble, so you have to, it's not only me and Pedro, it's also you students. We become part of a very small portion of the society, and a lot of these people said they don't want to vote. And if they start not voting, then it means that it's really trickling down to larger groups. And indeed, we might have a very low turnout, which is a big danger. And then we have to see who wins in the low turnout. I mean, when Trump won, or George W., he won because he managed to have a lot of votes of people who would never have voted otherwise. And then he brought people to vote. And if this could also be the outcome of the actual campaign. And last thing, historically, Italy had one of the highest turnout in Europe. So during the Cold War, there was a lot of politics became part of the life of everyone. So very high rate of political participation. Everybody had a political party membership. Everybody was going to vote. There would be these buses going with people, elderly or people with from the hospitals that would bring people to vote, and they would bring people back. So that was really it was a broad effort. Now there is nothing of that. So let's see how many people will vote.
Cole.
Yeah, that's kind of what my question was on the lines of too, to do with like political participation and like with voter turnout getting lower. Like I think the last Italian election, it was like the lowest it's been. If this one continues to go lower, like how will that affect the legitimacy of this election and future elections?
This is a very important question, because this is also elsewhere and everywhere. This is the problem, right? Because on the one hand, when you have populist parties and then all these new movements coming to the story, some might say, well, it's a problem because then you have a lot of these crazy people just talking a lot of nonsense, and then the political process is spoiled. But they appear precisely because there are certain pockets of voters of the electorate that does not feel represented. And what they do, and that's a real positive aspect of populist movements, is that they bring people to vote. Otherwise, these people wouldn't vote. The 30% that the five-star movement got in Italy in 2018 would not have been possibly voting for anyone else. So you would have had even a lower turnout than what you had. I think it was around 70% in 2018, and in the Cold War we had 95, just to give you the idea. And it's going, it's 20% less is a lot. And when it comes to the legitimacy, I'm a political scientist, so for me this is very important. So I would say it is very important. But then I read the stories. It's not very important. Look at Brexit. Brexit was voted by like less than a quarter of the Brits. Did anybody say anything? No. Now, if we're going to have a turnout of 50%, there is one political party who has the majority for one vote and one member in parliament, they will say, well, we won the elections. And people wouldn't be able to make that connection. So unfortunately, this is one of the most problematic unspoken thing that we have, which is a low number of people is technically supposed to damage the legitimacy of the institutions, but we don't talk about this. It's like of an unspoken thing, because it is the case. I mean, a lot of people don't follow anymore because they don't care who is in government. Their life continues anyway. To be very optimist, you can say, listen, this is a positive sign of the institutions. It's like in Belgium, they didn't have a government for 2.5 years, and the economic growth was higher than when they had a government because they were struggling to have one. So the point was, we are better off without a government. That's the other part of the story. We created systems with so many institutions that they can also survive without a driver. And maybe without a driver, it's even better. So that's also the attitude of many people. And this is the success of institutions, that you might have everything going, even if in charge you have people that are not qualified, not competent, or even not legitimate to do that, because then life for you will not change that much. So as again, long story short, as a political scientist, I think the legitimacy is very affected by the fact that few people go to vote. In practice, I don't see this in Italy or also unfortunately elsewhere.
Maybe in the short term, but in the long term, you might even argue that that's a European long phenomenon. Like, I mean, ideally, the Europeans wanted to have an institutionalized structure to the point that you do have an autopilot. And then it's sort of like, comes into a problem when you're looking for a plan B and you don't have one. So you have like an economic crisis and you're scrambling around. And then it creates all these little pockets of resentment that after time, they just sort of morph themselves. And then, to me, like the question about, the Georgia Maloney, and I think you answered it, I like the answer in the fact that, you sort of repointed me in a direction, because I'm not looking at her number, I'm looking at the collective number of the center right, because you're telling us it's sort of they go Forza Italia, they go to the League, they go to Brothers of Italy, depending on what the soup du jour is, kind of a thing that you were going to, right? But if that number then jumps, and then if I look at the number of participation also going down, those are the numbers that I should be looking at and saying, oh, maybe there's a red flag here. Because, we had Sweden 2 weeks ago. We had France, at the beginning of the summer, with this president this way, parliament this way. And now Italy, I don't know. I think those are maybe not red flags, but certainly yellow flags for Europe.
No, absolutely. Europe has, this is a European problem. It's not an Italian problem, indeed. And one of the explanations, or one of the stories that we have in Europe that we don't have elsewhere, is the European Union, because we also have European elections. Now, this is actually one of the cleavages that we've seen clearly in a lot of European countries, especially after the Greek crisis in 2010. In that moment, you started to see people that were against the EU and for the EU, being against the euro, leaving the euro. There was a big discussion in a lot of European countries, and the political parties started to align over that. So one of the cleavage of the past was high taxes, low taxes. And one of the new cleavages is, are you for the EU or against the EU? Are you with Orban or with Macron? So there is this connection. So the European Union in Italy and in Europe is a very important factor, to the point that many people will say, well, it's useless that you go to vote now because everything is decided in Brussels. And that's why then you see, a lot of, different participation levels in the national and the European elections. On the one hand, the one that go to vote for the European, it's not very high. In certain Eastern European countries, is 15, 20% vote for the European elections. And then others, they do not go to vote. They say, well, we don't go to vote because the European Union decides everything. And there is this tension there. Who makes the decision? And that's one of the problems that we have, this reconfiguration of political ideas and political groups in Europe is also due to the fact that some of the markets or the problems have been and are still very national, but a lot of the solutions are European. So then the discussion is, where do you participate in the decision making? Do you need to go to Brussels, or do you need to talk in your national debate? And this is, I think, one of the tensions that explains also why the voters are a bit confused, less attached. They are also disillusioned, so they think that whoever they vote for, nothing is going to change for them. So they just carry on and they forget the elections. But indeed, this is, this is a luxury. Yeah? This is a luxury also. Again, I want to back to what I said before. If you have a car that can, and then you can get into the car, and then you get to destination safe, even if someone without a driver's license is driving, it means that the car and the system are pretty good, because it means you don't get killed, even if the driver is incompetent. Same thing for our political systems. We have created in the European Union a very a complex web of institutions at the European and the national level, which means that it's very difficult to change things very radically, which creates this anger against the European Union or against anyone, because it thinks that changes are impossible. But difficult changes are also protecting us from people who would come from the incompetent driver coming and sitting in the driver's seat and wanted to change everything. But indeed, again, I'm talking too much again, but indeed, to go back to the question, yes, participation, the low level of participation is a European problem. It is a trend, but I still stick to my answer. I still don't see the recognition that there is a problem, and the recognition that, or the connection between lack of voting and lack of legitimacy. I rather see this the other way around, that the institutions do not have the legitimation, and therefore people don't go to vote, not necessarily the other way around.
Questions? Yes, Jake.
You kind of touched on this, but I was curious, is there a lot of concern in Europe or in like Brussels over the elections in Italy, or over like what it might mean, in the same way there was concern over like the elections in France earlier?
Yes, there is a lot of concern. There are two reasons. For the French election, it was mostly for Russia and for the crisis in Russia. But for Italy, it is for Russia, and not only for that, but also because of the economy. Now, do you know what's the GDP of the European Union?
No, off the top, no.
Yeah, it's similar, a bit higher than the one in the US, so around 20 trillion, right? More or less. Petros, what's the GDP of Greece?
I don't know. Yeah. 100
Back
something,
in, sorry?
100 something billion? Not even.
Yeah. No, it's a bit, yeah, it's around, back in the days, especially with the crisis, it was 15 trillion and 300 billion. So we're talking about that magnitude. And for that crisis of one small country of the European Union, the entire thing was collapsed. Italy is way bigger than that. So if there are big problems tied to one of the largest economies of Italy, everything else collapses. You cannot think that the European Union can survive with a bankruptcy in Germany or in France, but all in Greece. Now, the system is way more resilient than in 2010, but at the same time, there is a lot of concern because of Russia, because of the economy, and because of this a network of countries or regimes that are becoming, they are antagonizing a lot what the European Union stands for, which is Orban in Hungary and Poland. Now, if these numbers, and then there are a lot of, now we have Sweden with the far-right government, something very close to what you would call the Nazi party in Germany got a lot of votes in 2010, 2015. So there is something happening in the European Union. And so every time that there is, there are elections in countries where the winning of one or the other could change this big or contribute to these big moves, these big waves, then there is a lot of concern. Yes. But von der Leyen said, listen, no worries, guys, that she had to calm down the market. No worries, no matter what happens in Italy, we're going to take care of it. We have the instruments to contain and to manage. So she had to go public with that, which means that there were a lot of concerns. So indeed, there is a lot of discussions about the results in Italy, especially because there is one expected result. Now, the question is not at the moment who is going to be winning, but by how far one side is going to be winning over the others. And of course, we don't know yet, but these are the perceptions at the moment.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, to your point, I mean, Greece is only 2% of the euro. 2%.
Yes.
Of the euro. Yeah, and von der Leyen actually made a public statement about Poland and Hungary and Italy. They have the means of handling all of that. Questions. I have a more nuanced question. I mean, what about that move by Matteo Renzi and moving away, that third pole kind of a idea? How much credibility is in that?
This is the way in which it came about was very improvised, but there is a political logic behind it. So basically, there were two strategies for the center left. The first one was to unite everyone against the center right. The idea is an old idea by Romano Prodi, which he called the olive tree in 1996. You have a very large front and then against the other. So you put everyone on your side. The Democratic Party started to do this. That was the idea a year ago. Then the way in which the elections were called kind of broke the relationship between the Democratic Party and whatever was left of the Five-Star Movement. So that group was out. Then the Democratic Party started to talk to Azione of Carlo Calenda, and then they signed an agreement. And 2 days saying a few things. A few days later, the Democratic Party went to the Greens and the former communists and signed another agreement with them. In that moment, Calenda had to make a decision. And then he said, listen, either I stay in this half-large coalition where I'm very different than these Greens and the former communists. So we are very different. Going into an electoral campaign like this would have made sense if we were all together. And then the idea would be to go against the others. But since we couldn't do this, and we're getting the worst of both worlds, so not having a large coalition and not having a coherent message, so what I do, I go by myself and I have an alliance with the former Prime Minister Matteo Renzi, who was already running by himself. And then they're saying, listen, we are in the center. The political bet is we have a very coherent political program. And this is one of the other cleavages, like competent versus the competent, that is also dividing how you vote for a political party nowadays. And their bet was, we want to steal the more moderate votes from the center right. Because we talk about lowering taxes, because we talk about we are competent, because we talk about having a friendly environment for companies. We talk about these things. So some of them might come with us. If that happens, especially due to the electoral system, then we go to elections and no one will have a majority in parliament. And then once nobody has a majority in parliament, then we can see, maybe we can even continue with Mario Draghi as prime minister and a number of parties, a little bit from the center right and the center left, voting and supporting for Mario Draghi in continuation of his government. This is also one of the explanations of the hypothesis why Mario Draghi has not said anything in this electoral campaign. He's been the prime minister, and then he's been saying a couple of things against a couple of ideas, but really he didn't participate in anything. So that is the political bet there. They want to steal some of the votes on the center right, or conquer some of the votes that were in doubt. People that said, I don't want to vote. And then maybe with a coherent political program and this idea of being serious candidates, then they will get the elections. So they will get some votes. The bet that Calenda and Renzi are going for is, if we manage to get 10 to 12% of the votes, given how the system works that I was trying to explain that before, in the Senate, the center right will not have the majority. And if they don't have the majority, they will have to come to us and talk. And then we'll see, and that's another ball game. Because then I say one last thing, Petrus, and then I let you. Both in the center right and in the center left, there are multiple political parties, as I said before. In both parties, in both coalitions, there were political parties that were supporting Draghi and they were against Draghi. So the idea for Calenda was, I'm going to talk only to those guys afterwards. Maybe only us, whoever was supporting Draghi until today, might be supporting Draghi on Monday. So let's see how that the elections comes about. But that's the idea that they have, both Renzi and Calenda.
Great. I couldn't start a better way this semester than this discussion. A lot of times, people don't know, as teachers, we learn from our students, but there is no greater pleasure than seeing a student do this well and be schooled by a former student, as I did this afternoon, and all of us. It's great to see you. Thank you very, very much for your afternoon and evening, and we took you away from dinner too long. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The pleasure was mine. It was a pleasure to see you. Pleasure to see you all. Enjoy the rest of the day, and maybe one day I'll come in person. It would be a great pleasure of mine to come
The doors are always open, and I hope Italy wins on Sunday.
back. Are you talking about the football, or are you talking about?
Both, whatever it takes.
Okay.
Ciao.
Thank you again.
you.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everybody.